Okay, today we are introducing a new unit, postmodernism. And postmodernism takes us from after World War II, from 1945 to the present. And I've mentioned this in class at the very beginning when I introduced all of our literary movements, but I do think in time that will change. 9/11 was such a pivotal moment in US history. I do think that that is going to be whoever makes these decisions about what the official literary movements are, that is going to probably be the end of postmodernism. And then that would mean we are in a new current era that has yet to be named, because you have to get a little distance from it before you can really look at history with a little more objectivity. And it's also interesting now with the in the middle of this pandemic that will someday, 50 years from now, that's going to be a bullet on a slide of a literary movement, and how the COVID-19 pandemic influenced writers. People are writing songs about this and poetry, and it's going to influence story writing and storytelling. So that'll be interesting to see how all that pans out in the coming decades. But postmodernism, so some historical context. In the 40s and 50s, we had the Cold War, which was a time in the United States that produced a lot of fear. There was a lot of unknowns. And so you had people building, nuclear fallout shelters in their backyards, and there was a lot of distrust of the government and the powers that be. So that was a major factor in some of the literary voices we saw coming through. We also had the civil rights movement during this time period, which of course is huge, with Martin Luther King leading that political movement against racism in the United States. And we are looking at some works that reflect civil rights idea. We're reading Alice Walker and Gwendolyn Brooks, some African American authors in this unit, so we'll get to see some of those voices come through. We do have a continuation of the feminist movement, maybe not in the same way as we saw in realism and modernism, but that idea is still there. The assassination of Kennedy was again a pivotal moment in U.S. history, and it really just reflected the uncertainty of this time. This certainly was a time in American history where there was just a lot going on. There were a lot of variables, and there was a lot of fear in a lot of people's minds, just of the unknowns of what was happening. We also have Nixon and Watergate, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Basically, the first recorded instance of just blatant abuse of government power, someone using their power for his own good, and which created even more distrust in authority. We also have man landing on the moon in the 60s. Of course, that was a big deal, that people saw as just a big step for humanity. I really should also have the Vietnam War on here. I'm not sure why I don't, but that was another big historical component in this time period. And then finally, I always kind of laugh at this one, but it is important. The invention of the internet in the late 70s, early 80s, I believe. It wasn't widely available till the 90s. I still remember as a middle schooler, maybe 8th or ninth grade, when we first got dial-up internet at our house, and it was a very big deal, and it certainly has changed the way we communicate and gather information. So, like I said, this from 1945 to the present is a huge span of time, and a lot has changed in that time. So, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around it, but this just gives you the basic historical context of what's going on here. As far as literary characteristics, in a lot of ways, postmodernism is a continuation of modernism, particularly in the focus on new techniques. Authors are still trying to create new ways to have their voices heard, new ways of telling stories, new ways of writing poetry. We'll see that, especially when we study Sylvia Plath. She's one of our first confessional poets. We'll talk about that. So that's a big deal. As far as just philosophically speaking, a lot of postmodern authors begin voicing this belief that there is no absolute truth. And, in modernism, we saw a lot of authors searching for meaning. We saw that in Prufrock. He's desperate for connection. He's desperate for some meaning in his life. But in a lot of the postmodern works, it's kind of this very sad, empty, life is meaningless. We exist and then we die kind of situation. So it's kind of a dark outlook. We see that too in the rise in dystopian literature, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. The more popular dystopian works like The Hunger Games and works like that. But that really does kind of rise out of that idea of life is meaningless, or it can rise out of that. Fascination with language. This is really interesting. We see authors using words in new ways. And some of this we're not studying in the works we're covering, but in the author project that I'm going to introduce soon, you'll see that. Kurt Vonnegut, E.E. Cummings, some of these other authors who are just really experimenting with how they use words. Metafiction is stories about the telling of stories. And we do see that in some of the works we're studying. We'll see that in Sylvia Plath. She writes poetry about writing poetry, and it's very overt and it's very explicit. So that's what metafiction is. Stories about stories. And then finally, we have a good bit of Black humor, and this has nothing to do with race. Another, synonym would be just dark humor. So basically, finding something funny that should not be funny. And we'll see this particularly in the Southern Gothic works that we're studying, which I'm going to introduce in the next video. But as a whole, you can see postmodern literature is very raw. It's very gritty. It's kind of a dark outlook on life. And so we'll be able to see that in some of the works we read. A lot of this I really enjoy. I love Southern Gothic literature. It speaks to my roots as a Southerner, so that'll be fun for us to delve into. But for now, we'll sign off, and I hope you found this helpful.